Adam Wilson, and this is UC3P.
Hello, and welcome to Kinda Sorta Brown, a University of Chicago public policy podcast. My name is Rei Bertoldi, and I am one of three of your hosts here at Kinda Sorta Brown. I may or may not be recording this after the fact, and your other two co-hosts, Kurt Nugent and James Johnson, might not be in the room right now. They're not in the room, but don't worry, you're going to hear their voices shortly. Today, we're going to be talking about how intersectional identities shape work in the nonprofit and public sectors, as well as tensions and stigmas that exist between marginalized groups, and how diversity of perspective can inform more effective policymaking. Our guest today is Kelly Saulsberry. Currently, she works as the Director of Policy and Outreach at the City of Chicago's Commission on Human Relations. There, she works on policy implementation related to Chicago's human rights and fair housing ordinances. She conducts outreach and constituency building to bring people together. During her time at the mayor's office, she drafted and implemented community roundtables on various issues, such as low-income housing, expanding transportation options, and financial empowerment in underserved communities. She is also an alumna of our very own Harris. Welcome, Kelly.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. We're feeling very honored by having you here. I know you've had the luxury and the privilege of speaking with the illustrious James Johnson.
Yes. Fantastic on the panel.
That was a good event.
For Diversity Week. You were
You
great.
crushed it, though.
Oh,
you crushed it. Much of an inspiration.
Oh, thank you very much.
He's been talking about the metaphor you used.
With, like, the sediment and a spoon. Could you,
yes.
repeat that for us one more time?
I would love to. So I practice Nichiren Buddhism, and that metaphor I used was from Jose Toda. And Jose Toda was a second president of a lay organization of Nichiren Buddhists that I practice with, Soka Gakkai International. So in Buddhism, we often talk about a lot of the things that upset us or trigger us. It's because there's something inside of us sometimes that those events or that person is bringing out, or something that we have to work on, or that kind of thing. So in this particular metaphor of Jose Toda's that I mentioned, Toda talked about there being a glass with water in it, and the water looks very clear. You can see through it, but there's sediment at the bottom, but the sediment is still. You don't know that it's there. The water's clear, and then you introduce a spoon and you stir the water, and then all of a sudden the sediment that was just sitting there at the bottom comes up. Now the water is muddy and it looks dirty and undrinkable. And oftentimes as human beings, our first reaction is to blame the spoon for the sediment. But if there were no sediment in the water, there wouldn't be an issue, right? So that's what I shared.
That gets me every time I do it.
That's beautiful.
So much self-reflection to do.
Yes.
So in lighter news and lighter questions before we head out to the more personal interview questions, as someone who is a recent transplant to Chicago and from the Deep South where public transportation is a huge myth, I'd love to ask you, just very lightly, what's your favorite CTA line?
Next stop, Chicago. I don't know why. I just love that. I just love that. I just love that voice. I don't know who does that voice, but I want to meet that person who does that voice. It's just, so I love that. But you mean line in terms of the actual transportation lines, right?
Yeah.
So I like the Green Line because I'm a little biased because I'm a South Side gal in Bronzeville, and so
Shout out to Bronzeville and 51st.
That's right, Bronzeville and 41st on my end. So yeah, I'm a Bronzeville girl. So I really do like the Green Line, but I would say that for me the most fascinating line in the city is the Red Line. You want to get to know Chicago and its breakdown in terms of race and in terms of socioeconomics and in terms of different pockets of the city and demographics, and be able to, almost as a sociological experiment, get on the Red Line, either starting at 95th or Howard, and go to the opposite end. And you can see the changes of the different types of people on as you go from one end to the next. It's fascinating. I highly recommend every Chicagoan do it, but definitely recommend any visitor or transplant to Chicago to do it. I mean, it's very reflective of how the city is planned.
We actually had a pretty good conversation about that before you came in reference to the Green Line. Because if you catch it near Kurt's house, it's predominantly person of color train. And as you get closer to the city, you kind of watch that transition like take place.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's fascinating and horrifying at the same time.
Yes. And with the red line, it runs through even more diverse parts of the city, and it's the longest line. I think it's the longest CTA line.
So when do you feel like you began to start grappling with your own intersectional identity, and who and maybe what communities do you feel were helpful on like your journey in discovering yourself?
Well, I would say something that sort of put me on that path to thinking about who I am in multiple ways. I grew up in a Black neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, wonderful community of folks. And how I saw myself was, because my elementary school education took place in Black schools with predominantly Black teachers. My parish community was also on the south side of Chicago. I grew up Catholic before I became Buddhist. It was a predominantly Black parish, and then my neighborhood was Black. So I saw myself as, number one, normal. I wasn't a minority in my most immediate environments, and did not see myself as that. And I still, that term makes me cringe, the term minority. In terms of my racial identity, I was the norm, right? I didn't see myself as a person of color even. I don't think that term was around then, but it just wasn't as popular quite as it wound up becoming. Definitely grew up with a sense of cultural pride, ethnic pride, and that kind of thing. But I saw myself, if any identity, as being most familiar with my racial and ethnic one. But then I go to college. I went to Wellesley for undergrad, and I took a class that turned my world upside down. It was a class with Professor Judith Rollins, brilliant woman. And she was in the sociology and the women's and gender studies department. And the class that I took, African-American feminisms. And so my introduction to feminism was actually learning about all of these Black women throughout history and the present who made indelible marks on the culture in this country, on the political landscape in this country, and who just make contributions in so many ways. And so that really got me to thinking about myself as a woman in a way that I hadn't thought of before. And so there are feminists who are like me, who don't fit these stereotypes of what feminists are. They aren't all white women. They aren't all women from the past. They are also poets and artists and politicians and mothers. And it was also my introduction to, people, these feminists who are really, in terms of their art, in terms of their politics, who were approaching things from a variety of different perspectives in their work, from dealing with issues of socioeconomic class, race, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And seeing a kind of like a body of work, their analysis, their political work reflect these intersections, if you will, really blew my mind open. And it helped shape my own thinking in terms of, I am many things, I'm not just one thing. And being Black isn't even a singular thing. Black people, Black Americans are not a monolithic group. We're also very diverse and have multiple identities, just like every human does. So I would say that was the class, and that was the experience and the discussions in that class and the readings and the points of the opportunities for self-reflection really put me on the path to thinking about intersectionality, not just from an academic perspective, but from a personal one.
Yeah, college is a really interesting place. Mm-hmm. Like, you go through so many awakenings and transformations, and kind of like going with what you were saying, I remember going into college and it was just like very predominantly white, and it was kind of like almost a culture shock, but then also having amazing teachers and amazing classes that taught me so much. And but yeah, so now you are the Director of Policy and Outreach at the City of Chicago's Commission on Human Relations.
Yes.
We're just curious to know how you feel your identity has informed your work and continues to inform your work as director.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say, in addition to my identity, I would say just my life experiences and upbringing as well. So the Commission on Human Relations at the City of Chicago, it's a city department that enforces the city's human rights and fair housing ordinances. And we do that through investigating discrimination complaints in employment, housing, and public accommodations. We also advocate for victims of hate crimes, and we mediate conflict in neighborhood communities. So that's the scope of our work. In terms of my life experiences and identities that shape how I do my work, I would say growing up in the kind of family that I did. So my parents were very active in Chicago politics when my sister and I were young. So I have an older sister. She's 7 years older. And both of us grew up in a household with parents who were all about civic engagement, political engagement. And I remember being a very young girl when Harold Washington was running for mayor. And my parents helped register voters, took my sister and me with them to rallies at UIC, town halls, Operation Push on the South Side. And I grew up knowing what an exciting time this was, that we had an opportunity, we as a city had an opportunity to elect our first Black mayor. And he was brilliant. And I could see just from my parents, as well as our neighbors and so many other people in the city, that this was a time of excitement. There were so many people who were watching the news and getting engaged and getting involved and knocking on doors and those kinds of things. So even though I was very young, I certainly wasn't too young to understand the significance. And my parents made sure that I did. You know, they talked to me about it. And so growing up in a family like that, being involved in different organizations in college, student groups that addressed issues of bringing cultural groups together, sharing culture. I think that's important. Oftentimes, I think when we talk about differences between racial and ethnic groups, it's a point of contention or resentment or strife, but there are also a lot of things that we can learn and share with each other. So I had opportunities to do that in college. I was also involved in the Black organization of students called Ethos, and I was involved in the LGBTQ student organization at Wellesley College, which had all kinds of people in it. And so I would say my upbringing and then my work, volunteer work as a student in student groups really shaped how I do my work, in the sense that, number one, I do care about people and think that if we really, want to make a big difference in society, we have to get involved some way. Mm-hmm. We have to respect people's humanity, number one. We are all human beings, no matter who we are and what our identities are. Our lives are worthy of dignity and respect. And there's no way I could not care about people's civil rights and their human rights. And so I care about those things very much. So that shows up in how I come to the table, and being from multiple groups that have been discriminated against. I mean, gay people, women, Black people, people of color more generally. I do have a level of empathy with anyone who feels that they have been disrespected or marginalized or disregarded just because of my own experiences and the experiences of my ancestors. So I think that sense of history as well also shapes how I show up.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so
amazing.
much for sharing that. That was really, really powerful. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work in the nonprofit sector. So before you worked in the public sector currently, you were doing a lot of really awesome and impactful work here on the South Side, specifically sort of tangentially with nonprofit communities and the arts. Would you like to tell us just a little bit about your time here on the South Side with that? Sure.
So before working for the city, like you said, I was in the nonprofit sector. And so when I started working at the city in 2013, I worked in the mayor's office. That was when I started working for the city. Before then, my time in nonprofit involved working for organizations such as Ellen Stone Bellick Institute for the Study of Women and Gender in the Arts and Media at Columbia College, Chicago. Super long name, very heavy on the tongue. And that was a really fun job. I learned a lot. And basically what I did there, that wasn't based on the South Side so much as it was an institute that explored issues of access, representation, and participation in terms of race and class and sexual orientation, a lot of things in arts and media and culture. And so in my role there, I worked on developing a lot of collaborations with academic, cultural, and artistic institutions throughout the city, and public programs and panels and even performances. So didn't just do talking head events, but a lot of performances, dance performances, spoken word, but addressing those issues that I just mentioned. And so it was phenomenal to just work on all of these different collaborations and artists and academics and youth and students. So that was a very dynamic job. And I also learned a lot. It was an institute that had just gotten off the ground. It was brand new. So I also got to see how a young startup organization builds itself, how you plan strategically, what are your priorities, how do you conduct outreach and get people engaged and excited about what you're doing.